All right, thanks. Good evening, everybody. Welcome once again. Yeah, I do want to talk a little bit tonight about change and how we approach change in recovery. I think as addicts, we tend to really avoid change and avoid things in general. But change is something, of course, that happens in life. It goes with the territory, and there's a lot of change that occurs in recovery. And so I think traditionally people kind of want to put on the brakes and resist change or don't know how to deal with it. And so I just kind of want to talk about a couple of principles that I find useful in embracing change in recovery, especially early recovery. So, you know, of course, change is one of those things that's consistent, and the only one of those few things that's consistent in life, that things are going to change. We know that. But then we also know that recovery is all about surrender and willingness and acceptance, and those ideas of being willing to be open to change. And all those things involve giving up control. And one of the things we do, I think, generally, and when we are confronted with change, is try to grab onto control and make it comfortable and safe and at least manageable to deal with their own anxiety. So that the ask of people in early recovery is not insignificant, right? To be able to surrender, to be willing to change, to not always knowing what's on the other side when we take these actions. We just know that we need to give it up. And so I think that change idea is we know it's inevitable, but it still doesn't have to be fun. We also know that I think sometimes we have this mistaken belief, kind of like the COVID pandemic, that things will return to normal in recovery. And I think there is no such thing as, first of all, it's probably not a thing as normal, but in recovery, I think things may not go back to the way they were. In fact, many of us hope they don't, because that when it was bad, it was very bad. So I think this new life in recovery is something that also is going to involve change. And it's the kind of change, I remember once someone describing it as two trapezes, right? And when we get into recovery, we're on that first trapeze and we hit a point where we have to let go, and the second trapeze isn't quite there to meet us yet. We have to trust that it's going to come just on the basis of the rhythm, and we'll be able to grab it. But there's a point at which we have to let go of that first trapeze without being able to see and know that we can grab the second one. And I think that is a terrifying thing. And that really, to me, in my own life, that really represented that idea of surrender. Okay, I'm going to trust the process. And so that's kind of this inevitability of change that we have. So how do we handle change and recovery with all these unknowns and knowns? And I always start with the Serenity Prayer, which allows us to really evaluate what is our level of control over the situation. You know, is this something we have a remote chance of impacting, or is this something that we don't have any chance of changing, and we just have to really work on accepting? And of course, the third part of the Serenity Prayer is helping us understand what's what and to know the difference there. But I think at first, we may have a sense of we're totally unable to affect any circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so the Serenity Prayer is often very helpful in helping us discern, okay, what is it that I have? Maybe I can do this or that. Or maybe maybe all I can do is kind of take a break and breathe. You know, maybe I can work on accepting the situation as it is today. So there's all different kinds of options. And in the beginning of early recovery, I wasn't very good at picking those out and trying to figure out what my best strategy would be. So I really relied on the help of people, accountability partners and other people, sponsors, friends, to help us going through that. So it may mean, as I mentioned, the only thing we can do is take care of ourselves, right? In this circumstance, the only thing I can do to affect and protect myself is to go to meetings, to not be affected by HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, to make calls to people, to do all the program stuff. That may be the best I can do. In other circumstances, there may be other things, other actions and steps that we can take that we have to take. So I think that Serenity Prayer is a really, I think we kind of throw it around a lot. It's very commonly referred to, but it has a lot of wisdom. It packs a huge punch. The second thing is, I think once we kind of evaluate the Serenity Prayer is really being mindful of our process. As I say, when we're confronted with change, and often, especially in early recovery, there's usually a bunch of unresolved issues or problems. There's accumulation of stuff that we haven't taken care of. there's bad circumstances, there's broken relationships, there's anger and hostility, and sometimes there's physical illness and all this stuff that we have to deal with. And as we start to really awake and get a handle on these things, our defenses are going to really kick in. And so we might find ourselves being really pulled into fantasy more, or really thinking, well, maybe I could just skip a meeting and do something fun, or we might, our judgment and our thinking might get screwy. And I think we really have to be aware of how we react under stress, because in the face of change and early recovery, without our traditional coping addictions or coping skills to help us manage those things, we may be really have that urge to avoid and just escape. And that for most addicts, that involves fleeing into fantasy. So I think just to really be careful about that, because these changes can be really triggering as well. A third thing I think is really helpful is clarifying priorities. You know, when we have these numerous changes, numerous problems, a lot of stressors, especially in early recovery, we really have to figure out, okay, what is the most important thing I can do? And that's again where the Serenity Prayer, are these things I have any power over changing or controlling even, or are in terms of circumstances of my life, or do I just have to kind of accept it and let it go? And so that, for me, the guiding principle is, okay, what's important? And obviously in the beginning, what's important is my recovery, and everything has to follow from that. But I think it gets more complicated than that. How do I want to spend my time? You know, if I have some free time, do I need to just be quiet? Do I need to meditate? Do I need to get to a meeting? Do I need to make calls? You know, that even those kind of choices. And I remember, and Scott and I have talked about this in other webinars, where at least I, in the beginning, I was terrible at making decisions. I couldn't figure out what to do. I remember literally being in tears on the street in New York City because I couldn't decide which meeting to go to. I had a choice of 4, but my brain was kind of mush. And so I think that ability to be clear on where I put my effort, what things are going to really serve me, what's not going to serve me, and just that kind of clarity is important, but hard to find in recovery. A couple more things on this decision-making process and then embracing change. I think throughout this, self-care is really critical. And by that, I mean what I think of as the 4 dimensions of self-care, which are physical, spiritual, emotional, and of course, intellectual. And so we may feel a lot of strong emotions like grief. You know, recovery involves a lot of grief. As we wake up, we realize the harm we've done, the losses we've sustained, the things that can't be repaired. There's a lot of sadness. We realize the loss of our addiction, which is the loss of a good friend sometimes, you know, for all the pain it causes us. My addiction was my closest ally back when I was active, because that's what I thought, that's the only way I thought I could cope with the world. So I think we have to really take care of ourselves and not push away those griefs, not push away any strong emotions we may have, to acknowledge the losses we've sustained. So really to kind of be actively working on moving forward and not letting old pockets of feelings start to weigh us down. And then part of that self-care, by the way, I think is professional help, seeking professional help. I know that people can get sober without therapy. I just believe that therapy makes it so much easier and faster. I think probably years can be saved by investing in some therapy, just as I think residential treatment can save years of kind of trial and error, hit or miss kinds of stuff. So in many cases, it's well worth the effort. And then finally, as we start to go through this, just to monitor our thoughts, you know, I was talking to our clients today about monitoring thought patterns, what we call cognitive errors, where we tend to get into black and white thinking, or rationalizing, or minimizing, or catastrophizing. And we have these events that occur in our lives, and we put a spin on it. And if we're not careful, we can have our addictive sense of drama kind of affect how we react to these situations, and we can make it worse. So again, clarity. And I remember I've said this many times, but my sponsor used to tell me the space between my 2 ears is a dangerous neighborhood, and not to go there by myself. And I, in the beginning especially, I really needed outside people to guide me and help me clarify things, because I was unable to find my way out of that maze on my own. So in summary, the bottom line is change happens, whether we like it or not. I think if we can maneuver change while we're awake emotionally and consciously, while we're aware of our feelings, while we're using our tools, and most of all, we're connected to other people, that's going to make it a whole lot easier for the inevitable changes that are going to come. So I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. When I was in early recovery, somebody said to me, it was an old timer, and said, "Oh, you only have to change 3 things." Like, "Oh, really? Well, that I can do." And he said, "People, places, and things." I was like, "Yeah, that's everything." But he also pointed out in a different sit down with me, the old timers sat me down a lot. I was resistant. He also pointed out that if nothing changes, nothing changes. I was whining about, here I am coming to all these meetings and my life is still the same and nothing's getting better. I was like, yeah, because you're not making any changes. You just want to, if you don't do anything, nothing changes. So
Right.
Change is
so true.
I don't know that you said change is inevitable. I don't know that it's inevitable, but it's necessary for recovery.
It's a better word. Yeah.
Yeah,
better
I
word.
mean, without change, we don't recover. We just stay stuck in our addiction. So I really love this topic.
And you and I have talked about that too, where we see people who celebrate, 20 years, and they're the angriest, mothers we've ever met, and they're not in recovery. They haven't made those changes. They've gone to meetings, they checked the boxes, but it didn't work, right?
Yeah, that's dry drunks or addicts who are sober but not recovering, however we want to describe it. These people who have all the traits of an active addict without the active addiction, which actually makes them worse because the active addiction is their coping mechanism, so they calm down sometimes. But without it, then they're just raging.
That's right. That's right.
Which can be no fun for even them. But even guys like that, there's hope. There's a guy that I am now friends with, and at about the 30-year mark, he decided he was a dry drunk.
Wow.
And that he was going to make some changes, and he did. He actually did the work and took it to heart, and he always had a great sense of humor, but I mean, he was just hard around. And now he's lovely, and it's amazing. So we have one question left over from last week, so I'm going to ask a question first. I promised we would do it first. So let's just jump into the Q&A. Type your questions into the Q&A feature. We will get to as many as we can. So this question from last week is, can the concepts of internal family systems and parts therapy be useful in couples therapy in the context of betrayal? And the short answer that you gave last week was yes, and then we decided for the long answer this week.
Right. So let me give just a very brief background on internal family systems and the whole idea. So it's a brilliant concept where we start to look at parts of ourselves as child parts or parts left over. And these can be, the part of us that's a protector, or the part of us that's the victim, or the part of us that's the clown, or all these different kind of components of ourselves. And it is really a beautiful approach to therapy because it helps us understand those parts. And what we tend to do, I think, without the guidance of therapy in that context, is reject those parts. And the key here is to embrace them, right? The critic, to name one of mine, the sort of critic that kind of really, what's that critic doing? It's serving to keep people at a distance from me, so I can think I'm safer, right? If people don't get too close, so I can be really critical. So that's a piece. But instead of saying, "Oh, that's terrible, I'm so critical, I need to change that," what IFS would say, okay, let's look at what that critic is doing for you. Let's embrace the fact that the critic really wants to help you, and how can we manage that as the adult, right? These are the adult in the room, which is us, can now handle and manage some of these child parts and kind of say, yeah, thank you for so much for trying to help me, but I think I got this. So that's the idea of these parts of ourselves. And I think it's really totally applicable to any kind of relationship work, because those parts show up in relationships. In fact, those parts are often the primary role players in a relationship. So you may see the critic a lot. You may see the victim. You may see the anger guardian kind of person come forth. And I think if we can recognize, oh yeah, that's that piece of me showing up with my partner here in this situation? What's that about? I think if we can kind of understand that, and that all those aspects of ourselves that may be unpleasant or even not very likable, or that we don't even like, if we can understand what are they trying to do for us, and that they really all have good intentions, but sometimes some bad outcomes. But I think it really does help to understand, oh yeah, when I do this to my partner, I'm really it's that hurt little boy part of me that's showing up. I'm really hurt. It doesn't look like I'm hurt because I'm coming off as all angry and irritable, but it's really the hurt showing up. So I think it helps start to make sense of that. And then when my child, angry guardian shows up, then my partner's his own guardian may show up, that kind of thing. So we start to bounce off each other in the relationship. So understanding those and kind of making friends with those and dialoguing with those. I've had couples actually dialogue with those different parts of their partners. It's really useful, and I think it'd be really a nice growth process for any couple. But I think it adds a dimension, because I think sometimes in couples therapy, the behavior you see on the surface, which is so triggering for everybody, and it's what people react to, and it's what causes problems. That behavior is also, or often not. It has deeper roots. It has other kind of origins. And I think we need to understand those origins. For example, under anger is often hurt or fear. So if we really can see through the anger, see past the anger and say, wow, there must be a lot of fear going on here. This person must be really hurt. They don't look hurt. They look really pissed off. But so I think understanding those is going to be really important. So that's a longer way of saying yes, but yes. You're muted, Scott.
I just posted in the chat feature, we have two drop-in discussion groups, one for men, one for women, that focus on internal family systems work. They're free drop-in groups. So I just put the links in there, and I'm also dropping a link to feelingswheel.com. This is one of my favorite links.
Great.
Because that's the emotions under the emotions, and the emotions that derive from it just helps us understand what we're really feeling and why we're really feeling it. What's the core emotion, and then what might be under it and driving it.
And I think seeing it, being able to see those relationships, feelings aren't just these random things floating around, right? They're connected and they're layered, and there's hierarchies. And so, yeah, understanding it is really great.
Okay, next question here. Are there non-religious groups for 12-step sex addiction programs, or any 12-step programs? This is a great question, and I'm going to throw it to David, but I have thoughts too on this one for sure.
Yeah, and I'm going to speak in general, and then maybe you can answer for the specific sex program, Scott. So yeah, there are some alternatives. There's a Buddhist version of 12-step program called Dharma Recovery or Refuge Recovery, depending what coast you're on. Most fellowships have meetings that are for people who are non-religious or non-spiritual. And there's some even have their own literature. So you can usually find meetings like that do help you feel comfortable in such situations. I understand the need for those. I would encourage you to try out some regular meetings too, and really explore the concept of what regular meetings are even talking about when they're talking about spirituality. But there are some alternatives for general 12-step fellowships. And Scott, do you want to talk about the versions?
We could talk a little bit about the fact that 12-step groups are not religious, they're spiritual, and there's a difference.
Yeah, so for sure. I think a lot of people get hung up on the idea of a higher power and God in the literature, and a lot of the classic AA literature was written 80 years ago, and so it's very archaic, and there's a stylistic element that makes it hard to get around. I think that also kind of puts a layer of misunderstanding on it, but really, if you read the words carefully in the literature, it talks about a God of our understanding, and so they're really starting to make a distinction that Scott just referred to between religious, which is really about organized religion, and often issues of power and control and cultural morals and that kind of thing, versus spirituality, which is not so defined in terms of rites and churches or temples and religions and services and things like that. Spirituality can be in nature. Spirituality can be music. I mean, I have a kind of an eclectic definition of spirituality in my own life that came out of just things that gave me joy. And some of them involve nature, some of them involve other things, but it all kind of wraps together for me in connecting me in a way that gets me outside of myself. And so I find spirituality can be very personal. It can take many, many different forms, and it doesn't have to be religious in terms of, and I think of religious as more of a hierarchy and with dogma and judgment. I've usually been on the receiving end of a lot of judgment of religion in my life. So I don't have an affinity for that, but I do like the idea of a spiritual connection. In fact, I really see this in my own recovery, the necessity of a spiritual connection, because it gets me, it reminds me that there's something bigger than me in the world. And it also gives me a lot of peace and it feeds me in many ways if I use it. So, yeah.
Yeah, when I came into recovery, I was either an atheist or an agnostic, depending on my mood. Really, like depending on my mood and what day of the week it was. But I was pretty sure that religion was not for me. I had some not so great experiences, and I'm still not religious. 20 years later, I still am not a religious person. But like David, I have found a higher power that works for me. And one of the great things about 12-step programs is when they say God, they say the God of your understanding. And those last 4 words of your understanding, or 3 words, is really important, because what it means is, this is not religious. We suggest you find something outside of yourself. But you don't have to go to the Catholic Church or the Jewish temple or the Buddhist temple. Okay, thank you. So, I should know that.
Not religious, okay.
Now that said, there are some, in particular, Christian-focused 12-step groups. One is called Celebrate Recovery, if anybody's interested in that. Meetings generally have an element of Christianity, and then they talk about 12-step recovery, and all addictions are welcome in Celebrate Recovery. Specifically for sex addiction, I just put our link to the resources for sex addicts. The primary programs are Sexaholics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, and Sexaholics Anonymous. SA, SAA, SCA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, SLAA, but there's some new groups that have popped up, particularly around porn addiction. Like David, I invite you to explore. And if some group seems to have a little bit more of a religious bent than you would like, maybe you find a different group. My home group here, they have a meeting once a week for atheists and agnostics specifically. There's a chapter in the AA book written to atheists and agnostics. Being religious is not a necessity for recovery at all. Even being spiritual is not a huge necessity for recovery, although I do think it's very helpful. So yeah, explore. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater on that one. Next question. I am a male addict in recovery since last February and sober since March. Congratulations. I do have a full recovery schedule with many meetings, therapy, webinars, reading, and the like. Recently, I have been struggling with my partner, with my ego and ego issues. I've made some recent irrational and impulsive financial decisions based on ego. How do I, or how do you have, do you have any suggestions on how to let go of my ego and or tone it down? My partner has recently said that my ego is hurting and hampering our relationship. This is a great question and fairly common among addicts.
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations on everything that's going well for you with the sobriety and all the things you're doing. I think that's great. And I think lays a healthy foundation for the work you need to do. When I hear about ego showing up, and of course, ego, especially with sex addicts, we see a lot of narcissistic behavior, narcissistic patterns, kind of very, very ego-driven, all about my needs, my wants, my feelings, and all that. So I think that's a natural tendency that we do see kind of poking through sometimes. However, in general, in recovery, I think ego can be a problem because ego is, I was speaking earlier of defenses, ego is a defense, and ego is usually a layer over feelings that aren't so comfortable, feelings like fear or not feeling like I'm not enough, or feeling that I'm unlovable, or having a lot of shame. These are all those core beliefs that are so common with addicts, but especially sex addicts, especially that worthiness piece, the shame piece, the lovable piece. Those are all kind of at the heart of a lot of addictive disorders. And so those beliefs, those core, we call them core beliefs about ourselves, really need to be looked at in the context of recovery, and they need to be changed. I think you can't really progress too far in your recovery if you're still operating with these flawed, mistaken beliefs about yourself. You know, if I believe I'm unlovable and unworthy, that's eventually going to throw a hitch in my recovery plans, right? And so I think one of the ways people compensate for fear, for loneliness, for hurt, for stuff that's bubbling up underneath is ego. Ego shows up as a defense against those feelings. So I guess this is a very long way of saying what I would suggest is, since you're in therapy, work with your therapist on some of the emotional life that's underneath that ego. What was driving those financial decisions you made, or the other circumstances where you see ego intruding in your relationship? Is it fear? Is it a balance? I don't know what it is, but I think generally there's a feeling there, or feelings that ego serves as, in much the same way as our addictions protect us. They're kind of our coping mechanism, how we process information and deal with the world. Ego does that as well. Ego is all about control. Ego is the rational part of our brain that has a very specific way of how the world works, and not always a healthy view of the world either. And so I think it's our brain kind of wrestling with us. It's a power struggle within ourselves. And when ego shows up like that in decisions or with feedback from the world in terms of how we're interacting with people, it's just a red flag. And I think it's probably a very common and human, event to have ego show up. But ego is not the friend of anybody in recovery, because ego is going to kind of wrest control back, and start to tell us that maybe we could control this, or maybe this thing wouldn't be so bad, or we start to make decisions and do things that aren't very helpful for ourselves. So I think this is a great question, because this is the kind of the first vestiges of how people start to get off track. And I would really take a look at it, process it in therapy, and I would process it from that emotional point of view. What is going on underneath here? What am I feeling? What do I need? We talk a lot about addictive behaviors being in response to unmet emotional needs. I think anytime we see ego show up, it's like a little bit of our old self, on the scene, showing up just to make a statement. And I think that's where we really have to see what's really going on here. And I think with all the work you're doing, I don't think it's that big a stretch to see you kind of moving past this pretty quickly and continuing on your recovery.
One of the biggest shame tapes that plays in my head from early childhood is, what other people think of me matters a whole lot more than what I think of me. And, it's a shame tape. It's, as David said, this is shame, and this is my reaction to shame. So what I do is, I make sure I have the Mercedes and the expensive shoes and the nice clothes, because you'll think I'm successful. But there's a difference between that kind of validation, we'll call it, and actual self-esteem. David, can you explain the difference between self-esteem and this sort of externally based?
Right. Right. So when when we have these experiences that most addicts have in common of some trauma, some what are called adverse childhood experiences, but we are told or shown for whatever reason that we aren't enough, that we're unworthy, that we should have a lot of shame, and kids are very hyper vulnerable to that. I mean, if bullies on the playground, or if our parents, or an alcoholic father, or or the church, a priest, we're very vulnerable to these negative messages, and kids just absorb them like a sponge, and they don't have the ability to kind of refute them. And so when that happens, the only defense, the only way a kid can start to help themselves believe they're okay and that they have worth is by seeking validation from outside themselves. And so that's where the Mercedes and the fancy shoes and the house and the income or the body, people
and the sexual acting out,
and exactly the sexual, the conquest and all that those are all external kind of evidence to help prove to myself that I'm really okay. The problem is that all that validation in the world, there's never enough to fill the hole in me and make me believe I really am okay. And so that enters this chase. I'm chasing validation. There's never enough. I'm going for more. And so the difference between that and self-esteem or self-worth is this ability to generate that confidence from within that, hey, I know I'm okay, because I've done a lot of work. I can love, I receive love, I can receive kindness, I can be kind. I'm this feeling kind of sentient person in the world, and I don't need. Now, everybody, of course, do I like to be told? Do I like a compliment? Yes. Do I like a nice car? Yes. But I think the difference between that needing those things to feel okay versus just those are nice things, and if I were to lose all those things, I still know that I'm okay. That's the difference. And being able to generate that sense of contentment or knowledge that I am okay without all that external stuff is hard. And it takes some work, but it is a really important shift that occurs. And you can see it happening with people in the rooms, which is a really exciting thing to see, where they start to shift from that need to know just exactly what Scott said, to care more about what you think of me than what I think of me. And it's when I'm more focused on what I do, that's when integrity shows up. That's when I start to, my deeds start to match my words and my values, and all that starts to fall into place. But if I'm always chasing validation from somebody else, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I learned fairly early, although certainly not in my first year of recovery like you are, that if I want actual self-esteem, it has nothing to do with the car I'm driving or the clothes I'm wearing or, how thick my billfold is. It has everything to do with whether I can look myself in the mirror at the end of the day and say, you were a good person today. So if I want to have genuine self-esteem, I have to behave in esteemable ways. I have to behave like the person I want to be. So it was all, what would so-and-so do? I did that a lot. Okay, what would, I would not religious, so I didn't do the Jesus thing, but what would David do if David was like my, a guy with more time than me who had the kind of life I wanted to have, like with friends and smiles and happiness. What would David do? I would, and I would act as if, because I was clueless. so yeah. I like this next question too. The question is the arousal template change permanent? But maybe before you answer that question, you can, I'll ask, the precursor to that question is, what do sex, porn, and chemsex addiction do to a person's arousal template?
Right. That is the first part of that. So of course, the arousal template is that kind of map or vault in our head that has everything that we find sexually appealing and erotically charged. And every human being has an arousal template, and the way they work is that they, over the course of our life, we are constantly importing things in our arousal template that based on our experience have found, erotic. The problem is addiction, and especially intensity addictions like sex and porn and amphetamines, hijack that arousal template to such an extent with such high levels of dopamine and intensity that it kind of gets altered, and the word really is hijacked. Normal things that used to give us pleasure or arousal, not just even sexual things, but good food, music we love, great art, sports, whatever we used to really get joy from, even that starts to pale because we're only going for that high intensity behavior like porn or sex or chemsex. And so those changes, as we go through the changes, we start to get more, well, there's an escalation based on tolerance through the arousal template. So our sexual tastes morph, chasing that dopamine kick into things that are more taboo, things that are rougher, things that we get new fetishes, we get sort of behaviors that become less and less normal.
This is especially apparent with porn. It's easy to track with porn where that escalation in intensity, stuff that would have turned me off when I started, I now need to get arousal up in the intensity. Right. Sorry to jump in there.
So that's the mechanism by which the changes occur in the arousal template. Now, to answer your question, are these changes permanent? It's kind of yes and no. One thing we know from the arousal template is that once these high impact fantasies are there, that there's no way to kind of extract them. We can't get rid of them. And so this is one of the big struggles sometimes especially for meth users who have the most dopamine of all. Their sexual fantasies have gotten really dark and in an effort to get that dopamine kick. However, their fantasies morph into stuff that no longer matches the values of the user, especially once they get in recovery. And just those things, they may have seemed hot when the person was under the influence of their addictive behavior, but in recovery, not so much, right? These are not things you want in your head, the things you used to do. The problem is we can't just get them out of our head. And so the strategy is to kind of let those fantasies that were generated as a result of our addiction just kind of go dormant. We know we can't really extract them, but we can kind of let them get grown over and dusty, and we can forget about them. We can turn our erotic attention elsewhere. And that's what we need to do. Now, there is a technique that certain CSATs utilize called fantasy contamination. And it's basically going in, and it's similar to the process we use when we confront somebody who's doing euphoric recall, which is where I'm fantasizing, about the last time I did XYZ or smoked XYZ, and it's all, I can only remember the good stuff, right? I remember the preoccupation, I remember the high, I remember the fabulous times, the hot this or that, but I don't remember, the arrest or the $1,000 I spent, or feeling like crap afterwards, or the remorse, or the breakup of my relationship, or all that bad stuff. We can, in our fantasy, we kind of tend to just minimize. And so fantasy contamination is going through with a therapist and actually kind of walking through the fantasy with a more realistic view. It's like, this really isn't so hot, because this happens and that happens. And the idea is to kind of basically ruin the fantasy, right? By putting a big dose of reality onto it and kind of take the air out of its sails. The problem I have with that, depending on who I'm working with as a client, we're walking straight into their hottest fantasies. And those are very triggering. And the person has to be in a really good place. There's got to be a lot of safeguards. There needs to be tools to be able to emotionally regulate themselves if they get triggered. And so I think it's a dicey thing to do, but I know it is done on occasion. So these changes are there. How do we cope with it? We kind of let those addiction artifacts just go quiet and revive interest or generate interest erotically somewhere else. And then if you really are disturbed by something, you might work with the CSAT on doing that fantasy contamination, but take that really cautiously.
And one more thing to add about pornography in particular, pornography, people discover new things through pornography all the time. Anybody who's a sex addict or a porn addict has discovered some new part of their arousal template through pornography. But in point of fact, it's not really discovering something new, it's uncovering something latent. So it was always kind of in there, but it was just covered up. You were never going to go there until porn kind of shined a light in that dark corner, and you went, ah, and then you're aware of it, and it's very much in the arousal template at that point. And we can get really fixed and rigid and obsessive with things like that, even if they go against our values. What porn won't do is turn a gay person straight or a straight person gay. I'm a Kinsey 6. I'm 100% like far into the scale gay. You could show me naked women from now until the end of my life, and I am never going to get aroused because it's not in my arousal template. But there were a whole lot of things in my arousal template that I didn't know were there, and I kind of wish weren't, that porn did uncover for me. And those things are still there, but like David says, I just don't I don't take them out and have fantasies and play with them and reward them with masturbation and orgasm and things like that. I just have to let that pathway get overgrown and kind of hidden back in the weeds again.
Right.
Yeah.
And when it does seem like there's something new that's discovered, what's really happening is that there are usually sort of themes or patterns that involve dynamics, maybe power and control or something like that. And it just becomes the new fantasy really is a new version of the old theme. So in a sense, that's what makes things so exciting when we discover something new, is that it's resonating with us in some deep way.
Are personal human values absolute or flexible? Do they change under addiction and return when we're in recovery? When we're in recovery, for example, being polyamorous in the addiction and monogamous not in the addiction.
Interesting question. I think I haven't really thought about that in terms of absolute or flexible. I would guess off the top of my head, I would say human values under the influence of addiction do change and kind of are flexible. I think it's a common experience for the addict to kind of realize they don't like who they've become because of the things they do under there. And so I think I kind of choose to believe that the original values are kind of still there underneath, but they've been morphed and hijacked by addictive processes and all the kind of immediacy and the manipulation and all the stuff that goes with that leads us to do things that are not consistent with our values. But I think most addicts, at least in my experience, will say, well, I'd be able to identify that what they're doing is not congruent or consistent with who they think they are and what their values are. And so I think a lot of times the addiction has morphed it so that they're not really absolute, but they're, I guess, flexible. I think when we see people that don't have that awareness, when there's no acknowledgement that what people are doing is inconsistent with their values, then I think we start to move into that full of narcissism or antisocial kind of personality where people don't really have that awareness so often. But I think, yeah, I think addiction can morph them, and I think recovery can kind of bring them back. I also think that there's a journey sometimes in values, right? I think we can learn new values, we can learn new ways of dealing. I think sometimes if a kid grew up in a very dysfunctional household, they may not have learned certain values. And I think those can be learned in recovery. It's not like a window closes, we can never get them. So I think there's personal development that goes and growth that happens at the same time. But I think, so I guess in recovery, it's in my experience, it's a combination of maybe values reverting to what they were before they got kind of twisted by the addiction, but also sometimes there's new ways of understanding and being and that are formed in recovery. So I think, to just wrap up this kind of long-winded meandering answer, I think values are kind of always evolving, right? Hopefully they are, and not in a bad way, but so we can kind of grow and become more evolved in terms of our value statements. Scott, what do you think about that? I haven't really
You know,
thought about this
as you
specifically
were
before.
talking, I'm thinking, you know, one of the things addiction does is it kind of shuts down our prefrontal cortex, which is the
Right.
thinking executive part of the brain. It's what separates us from other animals. You know, the logic and maybe the values, maybe our value system lives in the prefrontal cortex. And when my addiction pops up, I basically unplug my prefrontal cortex. So I would think the values are still there. I'm just not able to access them in my addiction. Because I don't think my values are any different now than when I was a little kid, kind of before things went haywire on me. You know, I don't think we change these core aspects of ourselves. We might tinker at the edges of these core aspects,
right.
But the core of who we really are, the good person we can be, I don't think it goes anywhere in addiction. We just turn it off.
And it's true, because in addiction, we are operating from the midbrain, right, which is the emotional center of the brain. The wiser self, the higher, self is not awake and present. It's kind of cut off. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I like that.
The thought. I would love if there was some research on that. I'll go online and look tomorrow, but I kind of doubt it. It's not the kind of thing that somebody would think to research. But
yeah.
And it would be hard to research. You'd have to figure out actually where the values live in the brain first. How do you judge change when recovery is 2 steps forward and 1 step backward?
Yeah.
I mean, the net, by the way, is 1 step forward. So I'll just throw that out there.
That is change too, right? In the right direction. And it's true, recovery is not a straight line. So we do see the variations, the 1 step forward, the 2 steps back, sometimes we're the reverse. But I think generally there is a sense of forward momentum and movement that happens. I think change, there's a couple ways I think of measuring it. One is observable behavior change. What are people doing? Are people showing up? Are people talking? Are they sharing what's going on? Are they interested in other people and other things? Are they giving service? I mean, these behavior changes that are consistent with somebody kind of rediscovering those values we just spoke of, and being able to kind of be present and moving forward in their lives. So I think there's that behavior change piece, but I think there's also this core piece, and part of that is very subjective on the inside. I think we can feel it, and some of the frustration.
Not sure if I froze or David froze. If it's David who froze, somebody give me a quick chat.
The inside as well, you can start to feel it, but I think it really shows basically in how that translates into behavior and what happens there. And people do have change in terms of just how they start living their lives and their first reactions to things, and in all kinds of minute ways too. Just being kind, being patient, operating from some careful thought instead of an emotional reaction. All those kind of ways of living and being do start to change and they have to, because they get modified in recovery. So I think you can see it behaviorally on the outside, but the person can sense it inside as well, and change going on.
And I think the change is incremental. It's like watching a kid grow up. If you see them every day, you don't see them getting taller and bigger. But if you see them once a year, you're like, oh my God, what happened? Because you remember them and met 4 inches ago. And that's how recovery is. For me, the easiest measures were, I just felt better about myself. I didn't hate myself as much. And that was a big deal. And other people started treating me differently, which I think happened before me noticing the change. Somewhere near the end of my first year of recovery, somebody asked me they were going away for a couple of weeks, and they wanted me to stay at their house, which was like a $5 million house, and dog sit, their precious baby that they paid a gazillion dollars for. And I thought, do you know who I am? You're giving me a key to your house and the security code, and you're trusting me with your little animal. Are you sure? other people started treating me differently. I mean, nobody was giving me the key to their house when I was in my addiction. It wasn't happening. So yeah,
Interesting. Yeah.
and paying me to stay there, you know. So yeah, it's a combination of stuff. Next question is right up your alley, David. How do you unfuse sex and substance addiction? Is that even possible, or is it just management?
Wow, what a great question, and not an easy one to answer. So when we do two activities like sex and drug use, those two things fuse in a way. It's not just doing them at the same time; they become interdependent. So a trigger for one can trigger the other, and an experience of one can trigger the other as well, and just they get all interwrapped. And so one of the hardest things somebody can do in recovery is try to separate out sex, because the strategies are different. Obviously, if I've crossed a line and become a chemsex addict, I need to be abstinent from the drugs, but the goal is not to be abstinent from sex. So it becomes a matter of, okay, how do I reintegrate sex back into my life in a healthy way? It's something that was once an addictive behavior, and that so it's, walking the tiger, right, every day. And so that takes time because those drug cues are so persistent. What we find generally is some kind of period of abstinence to sort of separate the two, just let the brain do a little bit of a reset. But after that, it starts to really do the deeper work. I found almost every chemsex that I've ever worked with, if not everyone, has a lot of issues about sexuality in terms of the things we were talking about before, those core beliefs. I'm feeling unworthy, feeling a lot of shame, feeling unlovable. So all these are the deeper issues that kind of drove that behavior in the first place. And I think to have a chance of recovery, somebody has to really work on those deeper issues that allows them to start approaching who they are sexually as from a whole different perspective. Let me put it that way. And so I think then the task is to do this internal work. So I'm getting to know myself and like myself more. I'm feeling more of that internal validation that we spoke of. I am feeling more lovable, and that I'm feeling more worthy. That's all good. But then we also have to manage in a very careful way that we don't kind of pollute the sex again. So very often, and we know this from PET scans and fMRI scans, that when we know how our brains look if we ingest cocaine, for example. And we know that our brains look almost the same way if we think about ingesting cocaine. And so part of the problem with the sexual behavior is that there's apps on your phone, there's porn, there's all kinds of fantasies, there's all this other stuff besides the sexual behavior itself. And a lot of people make the mistake of giving up the drug they use with sex, whether it's cocaine or meth or marijuana or whatever. So they won't use the drug. They may not even be masturbating, but they're thinking about those fantasies. And every time they think about them, it's keeping them alive. And so that's what really slows down the separation of sex and drugs, is that people need to be totally pristine in terms of not looking at I've had clients basically say, I want to have meth sex without the meth, because meth causes all these problems. So they're not using meth, but they're looking at meth porn. They're looking at people injecting themselves online. They're caught up in the fantasy, and we know that's as good as taking the drug itself in terms of keeping you locked up in your addiction. So it's really just it's common sense. It's kind of getting away from those behaviors, being really pure with our fantasies, and starting to explore and heal from the inside out. And I think the combination of all those things does do it. I do have clients, and there's this thing called anhedonia in early recovery, this inability to experience pleasure. A lot of people feel in early recovery, since it takes so long, and the dopamine system takes up to 24 months in a meth user to come back to normal. So this is a long haul, and people feel hopeless, they feel impulsive, they feel depressed, they feel like they're going through this agony of not using their drugs and acting out sexually, and nothing's getting better. And so you got to remember that's a temporary state, but there's a period of kind of dark hopelessness. Sounds too dramatic, but I've had clients say that. It's like, is this ever going to get better? It's so frustrating, and it does. But it's very helpful to be around people who've walked that path and who are a little bit farther down the road and can give you support. but yeah, it absolutely is possible.
You know, we covered a version of this in the porn work group that I teach last night. This came up, and the question was, we were doing circle plans, which is, bottom line problem behaviors, slippery behaviors, and healthy behaviors. And we were talking about masturbation, and one of the guys asked, when I masturbate, is it okay to fantasize? We were talking about which circle masturbation goes in and what factors into that. And it's like, well, are you fantasizing about porn? And it was the same thing, a porn addict's brain pretty much lights up like a cocaine addict's brain.
Totally.
And also lights up when we're thinking about porn. They're pretty much indistinguishable. So from a cocaine addict in all the stages. And so if you're thinking about porn while you masturbate, not only are you thinking about porn, you might as well be watching it. I mean, we can play the movies in our head, come on. But we're also rewarding it with the pleasure of masturbation and orgasm. So now we're still reinforcing the addiction. We're giving positive reinforcement to an addiction that we're trying to get rid of. So just because I'm not looking at porn, it doesn't mean I'm not still using porn. And we end up talking about things like what we call not porn, which is sexy images that technically are not pornography. They may be clothed or whatever, but we use them to fuel our sexual fantasies. It's the same as using porn. And the porn guys are always like, so no more Instagram, can I watch this TV show? I'm like, I don't know, do you fantasize about the actress? Yeah, okay, stop watching. Yeah. It's porn for you, even if it's not porn. But it's on network TV. Are you fantasizing? Yeah. Okay, stop. So this happens. And we talked earlier about the arousal templates. Can you get something out of the arousal template? No, but you can kind of let it get overgrown and buried. But it's just double trouble with chemsex addicts. They have two things that have to get overgrown.
Two very strong things. That's right.
That have fused together into like a 10-lane superhighway.
Right.
And it's going to take a while for that superhighway to crumble. And on top of that, they're never going to have the intensity of chemsex again. They have to learn to want, I'm taking words out of your mouth, but they have to learn to want the other neurochemicals like dopamine or not dopamine, but serotonin and oxytocin, the connection.
Norepinephrine, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, rather than always just going for that big dopamine adrenaline rush.
Yeah, we could talk this a whole lot more. I think also just really quickly, chemsex addicts use high-powered fantasy to fuel everything, right? And it's really hard to match that kind of octane on fantasy in sobriety. And so I really try to work with people on using other ways to get aroused, like touch and
non-sexual touch,
and other kinds of ways to get that dopamine. Yeah, so there's all kinds of ways to expand the source.
We're out of time. We have a question left. I'm going to save it for next week because it's another big one. So I promise this last question will be the first question next week. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Great topic, David. Great questions today. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
So we'll be back next Wednesday, same time, same place.
All right. See you then, Scott. Good night.
Okay. Good night, everybody.